Welcome to part 2 of World War II. All right, so loading. All right, where we left off last was all of the people that were heading up these different countries in World War II. Now we're actually going to be in it. Well, this is still technically not quite the start of World War II, but we're real close. So, what's going on? Lots of countries in the middle of Europe did not want to redo World War One, and so they did everything in their power to appease or kind of give Hitler an inch to kind of make him happy, so as to not escalate a situation. Right? It's kind of like Thanksgiving at your house with all of your family. You really want to smack your brother or sister because they're super annoying, but you just have to sit there and grin and bear it because you don't want to make a scene. Kind of the same deal. So Hitler sends armed forces. First off, he starts by building up the military, which is violating the Treaty of Versailles. And he sends this military into the Rhineland, which is a militarized, or sorry, not militarized, manufacturing section that used to belong to Germany. And Germany really wants to get this section back because it can really amp up what they can produce in their country, can get people lots of jobs, and they see it as rightfully theirs, and they feel like they really got screwed on the Treaty of Versailles. France did not want to cause problems or resist on their own side or on their own and not they kind of go at it alone. And Britain was like, I'm not helping you because I'm not going to get involved in this fight. So Germany was allowed to basically walk into the Rhineland and take it over. Germany wants to expand and go into the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. This part of Czechoslovakia is kind of a little bit better situated militarily, has a lot more resources than the rest of Czechoslovakia. And when Hitler goes to do that, Britain said, well, I think that no one should own Czechoslovakia. It should just really be its own area instead. So there is a treaty that happens, a meeting that happens, and we've got a bunch of different countries who go into this meeting, Germany being one of them, Britain being another one of them. You know who's not invited to this? That would be Czechoslovakia. So it's called the Munich Conference. It's in 1938. And Germany, France, and the UK and Italy all get to go to this meeting. And when they come out of it, Czechoslovakia loses the Sudetenland, and Hitler says, we're going to make it independent. And then Hitler claims he's not going to try and take over any other parts of Europe. Czechs are just completely floored that this is being allowed to happen and that they don't get a say in what's happening basically to their own parts of their own country. So he gets everything, he talks all this stuff out. Hitler achieves all of his demands because he's like, I'll let the rest of Czechoslovakia go. So again, World War I, bad. France and Britain are just trying to avoid everything, so they use more appeasement. And that whole phrase, give them an inch and I'll take a mile, well, Hitler really does a great job of showing us what that looks like, okay? So then we've got the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. This is where Hitler is going to try and make nice with Russia, well, USSR, the Soviets. And the Soviets are really, they're trying to figure out their place in the world, and they see themselves as a rising power. So we've got a lot of distrust that's going on, and the Soviet Union opens up negotiations with Germany because they don't fully trust the British or the French or the United States for that matter. And so, as my cartoon here indicates, we've got Stalin and Hitler who make their own little pact called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Interesting, right? We're very creative with names here. And this Nazi Soviet is called the Non-Aggression Pact, and that's signed in 1939, in August of 1939. Poland is going to get divided up between Russia, well, USSR, and Germany. So they're going to split that. The public, that's a secret. So basically, what it looks like to the rest of the world is that they're not going to be aggressive towards one another. They're going to kind of be allies. They're going to help each other out. The secret part of this pact is that when they work together and Poland gets taken over, they're going to divide it between the two of them, right? So Poland obviously doesn't know this, and I'm sure they probably wouldn't be down for it anyway. What they're getting out of it, the USSR is going to sell Germany a lot of raw materials that Nazis need to amp up their war machine and produce a lot of stuff. And it allows Germany to move against Poland without fear that the Soviet Union is going to move in and block them. All right. So that's what this is all kind of saying. Russia's going to get part of Romania with all this as well. So this is end of August of 1939. Week later, September 1, 1939, World War II officially begins. It begins when Germany decides to invade Poland, and Russia kind of, with this non-aggression pact, helps out too. So they now had Russian neutrality, so that Russia wasn't going to be a problem. And because they'd been able to kind of take over other parts of Europe, the British and French really weren't going to try and stop them, right? Give them an inch and they're going to take a mile. So once Poland gets walked into on September 1, Britain and France actually decide that they are going to do something, and they're going to declare war against Germany September 3rd of 1939. Because remember, nobody else knows about the secret part of the non-aggression pact, right? So they're not declaring war on Russia. So isn't this lovely? Kind of how this works. Everybody wants Poland. All right. So we had Maine for the stuff about World War I. We have Mint for the causes of World War II. If you need a way to keep these two straight, alphabetically, Maine comes before Mint, okay? So we've got militarism, right? So I talked a little bit about that with totalitarianism, you building up all of your militaries. Imperialism, you guys all know what that means. Nationalism, it's like being patriotic for your country, only on steroids, really heavy-duty steroids. And then totalitarianism, okay? So that was the main things. If you had to pick and we were in class, I would tell you to go to one corner of the room for which one you think really made the biggest difference. We can talk about this in our Zoom meeting later. Two-front war. So a front is where the action is happening. World War II turns into a two-front war because the fighting is happening in two places. So those, again, are called theaters, two fronts, or the theater of war. We are not actually eating popcorn and having a good time. We've got the European fronts, so all the fighting that's happening in Europe. We've got from North Africa, so all down here, right, fighting happening in Morocco and Algeria and Libya and Egypt, all kind of into some of parts of the Middle East as well. We've also got all the fighting that's really happening, lots of fighting happening in France. Germany is expanding out in all these different directions. Here's Poland, and here's the USSR, right? So Germany is going to go down into Hungary and Romania and all these different places. Italy, remember, is an Axis power, so it's the blue versus the red, okay? Well, it's the blue and the red in this one here. I lied. Italy is blue, Germany is red. So that's what all of this action is kind of happening all over Central Europe, okay? Blitzkrieg, this is a new type of war. It just translated meaning lightning war. It's a super fast method that the Germans develop of warfare. So basically you're just going to, like lightning, come in, attack, and just keep moving. So the way that you're able to do this is with the development of tanks, which showed up in World War I, but now they've been improved. And then also with aircraft. So the Luftwaffe, again, that's not like some kind of waffle. It is the Nazi aircraft. So Blitzkrieg, that's how they're able to really take over. They strike really fast and quickly, like kind of like a snake. So Blitzkrieg goes into Poland, and it was so effective that Russia really didn't have to play any part and to help out to let Poland get taken over. France gets taken in 9 days. So that's hugely fast, right? Basically all of France falls in 9 days. Compare this to, 4 years of stalemate, hardened battle from World War I, where like literally you spend months fighting over like 100 yards. Okay. When France is taken over, I mentioned Vichy France. Here it is. It is a puppet regime. So basically, it's France, and Hitler's like, okay, France is now ours, and France is on our side. Well, they put people in France to kind of prop up the government and do whatever Hitler wants. So it's not really the will of the French people, but it's being occupied by Nazis, and they're running everything. And so they use blitzkrieg warfare throughout the entire war. It was very, very successful. When people talk a lot about the Blitz, that's usually referred to as just the Blitz, but it's fighting that happens in England, specifically London and some of the larger cities. Remember, England, it's its own island. You gotta go across the English Channel to get away from the rest of Europe. Germany tries to invade Britain, and no one's done this in a long time, since the Normans did it. The German Luftwaffe, that's again the Air Force basically of the Germans, versus the RAF. That's usually how they're referred to as the RAF. It's the Royal Air Force. In order to try and help this minimize casualties and help people in London, lots of kids are shipped out of London to the countryside, where they basically stay with foster families so that they're safe. We've got all of these handy dandy, like legit, like luggage tags on kids that say like their name and where they're from and where they're going. And this is where we get things like, believe it or not, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe comes out of this idea and this escapism, that kind of thing. So C.S. Lewis, check that out. There's also lots and lots of very heavily influenced biblical references in there. So you can read it through that lens as well. The two of them together, a really powerful story. So next time you watch it or read it, think about that. Germans can't really scare the British, right? So, and this had a lot to do with what Winston Churchill was doing. The never, never, never give up. Quote, morale did not break, only structures. And so you can see over here, I mean, they're bombing and bombing and bombing and bombing. And it's devastating to a lot of England. And again, this hasn't happened in, almost 1,000 years. So it's a big blow, but people of England persevere. We've got new technology, radar. That plays a role, sort of, or could have, when it comes to Pearl Harbor, and I'll get to that later. Sonar, we're talking about submarines and that kind of thing, and then the aerial bombs. So sonar, you can find out where the U-boats are, and that really allowed a lot of the Navy to protect England that way. Okay. So we do get into the war. We were very isolationist, like, leave us alone. We don't want to get into other people's fights. We're scarred too. So we kind of do this in stages. There's something called cash and carry. There is a Lend-Lease Act that Congress approves. And basically we're allowed to, if we're not going to necessarily come up with a treaty or any kind of long-term agreement. However, if a country wants to give us money and walk away with weaponry or other supplies, well, that's fine. So and of course, it's very much a gray area. Like if you're German and you're looking at this policy, you're like, well, you're really helping the Allies. And the US government's like, no, 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 we don't have a treaty with them. We're not specifically helping them. It's really, if you've got cash and we want to sell to you, then we will. This idea of an arsenal of democracy, providing supplies to allied or democratic governments to help things out. Roosevelt comes up with what's called the good neighbor policy. Basically, if you're a good neighbor, if you want to protect yourself, you need to also protect your neighbors and respect their rights as well. He uses a famous metaphor of, if your neighbor's house is on fire and you're isolationist, then you would do nothing. Well, if you do that, then the fire stands a much greater chance of spreading to your house and burning your house down. But a good neighbor is going to lend the neighbor water and a hose to put that fire out, because it really is in their own best interest to put out their neighbor's fire so that it doesn't jump over to your house. So that's how kind of Roosevelt frames it. And that he really starts to convince a lot of people to get involved. Then, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor happens, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, which you guys should know from your hippoing. And at that point, we declare war on Japan, along with some of our other allies, Canada and Britain. Then we get this pact that require, excuse me, that when we declare war on Japan, we've got an alliance then that Germany must then declare war on the United States. So basically, Germany's got Japan's back. So when that happens, when Germany declares war on the United States, we then in turn declare war on Germany. So now we're in it, and we're in it to win it. We are now fighting a two-front war, one in the Pacific theater, and the European theater. We've got General Patton over here, who is a hugely famous general and he's head of the U.S. forces. My dad loves Patton. Watch that movie. It's a great movie. All right, Pacific theater. So everything that's happening in the Pacific Ocean, that kind of thing. At this point in time, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Hawaii is not a state, it is a U.S. territory, but our entire Pacific fleet is parked in Pearl Harbor. So when it gets attacked, this is a huge blow to the United States, to our military forces there. Okay. And we thought we were safe because we thought that nobody could get to Pearl Harbor with the technology available. There was radar that was developed and was being used very minimally in Hawaii. Hawaii, the island nation, is very mountainous, lots of volcanoes and that kind of thing. And radar can't see through mountains. And the radar, there's a couple of trucks that operate for only a couple hours a day. And the U.S. officials, Army personnel who are operating them, they pick something up, but it's so new. When they send the report in, it kind of gets lost and nobody really pays attention to it. They think of it more as like a gadget or like a toy versus like a real useful means of intelligence, right? So obviously that starts to change and develop. But in the Pacific theater, we've got Pearl Harbor over here, right? So here's Pearl Harbor, here's Japan. Nobody thought you could go all the way over here. Then what happens is that changes. We've got island hopping, which is basically you're going to go from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, and try and take over and conquer all these islands. Nimitz and MacArthur, they are two generals, and they share command of the Pacific, okay? And Patton's got command of the European forces. So, military industrial complexes following the victory in World War I. So basically, people are becoming, all across the world, are becoming much more conservative, much more into their own selves, isolationists, and they're looking for growing their own empire, not necessarily helping other people. Japan does this as well. They build up these military complexes, and they're looking for these resources, which is why they island hop, trying to get all these different natural resources like rubber. Okay, like rubber plants to create things like tires and ways to build machines. Bushido, which is fight to the death. Basically, if you surrender, you're not honorable. So this is where we get kamikaze pilots, and this is also one of the reasons why people thought that Pearl Harbor was really safe, was because you couldn't get there and back again. But when those fighter pilots aren't planning on going back, that changes the game. It's a one-way trip, not a two-way trip. So Japanese policy, if you gave up, you're going to be killed. Emperor Hirohito really encourages this policy of sacrificing yourself for the empire. Your family gets things. You're known as a hero. It's all about this honor. 1931. Again, this is a little before World War II, right? So this is build up. Japan invades Manchuria, China, and they get out of the League of Nations. Then they go and invade Manchuria as a section of a region of China. Then they invade China proper. It's known as the Rape of Nanjing, and 250,000 Chinese people are slaughtered by Japanese coming in to try and take over China. Okay. So that's kind of a little background on Japanese and how they're trying to really build up their own military and their own presence in the Pacific. Then Pearl Harbor happens. I've got a little video snippet of the movie Pearl Harbor, which it's good for visuals and things like that, not good for like the overall backlash against Pearl Harbor. We didn't really want to enter the war. We're still trying to stay out of it. We're helping allies a little bit, but we're not really fully in it. Japanese see the United States as aggressors by helping allies. And so they want to basically get in there and do something to us before we have a chance to do something to them. We did do things like freeze Japanese assets where they couldn't get access to their stuff. And we would not give them resources like oil, rubber, that kind of thing. So they formed this pact with Italy and Germany. That's why it's called the Tripartite Pact. So basically, they're all allies. They're going to help each other out. And they put sanctions on the United States, but they're going to charge us money and or not trade with us at all. Okay. Obviously, Pearl Harbor happens. United States says, okay, yep, we're in it. Island hopping. Americans and Japanese, we fight through a lot of these different islands in the Pacific. We go from island to island. We're trying to basically keep up with each other. So the allies, that's Britain, and this is where you get a lot of Air Force and Navy working together. The allies go through and get past these strongholds instead of going to these small vulnerable islands. So it's called a leapfrogging strategy, right? So I'm going to basically, instead of going for, it's like the death of a thousand cuts. Instead of going straight for like the head and trying to chop off the main part, I'm going to attack all these other smaller islands that are much more vulnerable and get those. And then before you know it, I'll be able to conquer everything. All right. The fighting on these Pacific islands is terrible, hand to hand, very personal, sandy, terrible, just lots of infections and disease. The Battle of the Midway is very famous, happens in June of 1942, and this stops Japan from capturing the continent of Australia, which is Australia is part of the British Empire, and it is obviously part of the Allies. Okay, interesting story about Australia. My grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and we're very Scottish. My grandfather was born in Scotland and emigrated to the United States when he was 10. But as they were pulling into port in Australia, my grandfather, Grandpa Mac, started playing his bagpipe. And the funny thing is that whenever the Queen of England comes anywhere, the bagpipes are played, and everyone, knows that it's the Queen's ship and lines up and makes a big show because it's the Queen. So when my grandfather is playing these bagpipes on the deck of his naval ship and they're pulling into port, all these Australians, who's a British colony, think that it's the freaking Queen is on the ship. And so they all line up and they all get all organized. And it turns out it's just, it's just Adam Taylor McDonald playing the bagpipes on a U.S. Navy ship. So kind of interesting, kind of fun. All right. We also have a lot of code breaking and that kind of thing that's going on. So Japanese have their own code system. We break that code and understand it, and then we now know what they're going to do in the Pacific, and we can kind of head them off at the pass. War turns against Japan. Again, some of these code breaking things. The Navajo language, Native American language, is very complex. It's unwritten. Japanese have no basis in it, really. They haven't studied it. They don't really know about it. So the U.S. military employs a lot of Navajo Indians to be code breakers and to use this language to send things back and forth. And this is a great thing for Navajos, but at the same time, it's a complicated story and it's really bittersweet. Like, they're doing something great to help their adopted country because obviously they were here before anybody else, but at the same time, they're still being used by the U.S. and they're not fully recognized. Matter of fact, President Trump just gave a bunch of Navajo Indians, I think, medals of honor earlier in his presidency, but just they don't get the recognition they deserve. So this is one of these things that you guys can watch. This is what I'm talking about. All right, moving on to the European front. Operation Overlord. So all these little plans have names. This one's called Operation Overlord. You guys have heard of it before, called D-Day. Big plan put into place. Nobody really knows if it's really going to go off or not. Involves a ton of people. It's set for June 6th of 1944. 24,000 different soldiers are going to land at the beaches at Normandy in France. And it's going to, we're basically going to divide and conquer. We are going to try and confuse the Germans and weaken them and make them choose which side they're going to go onto. If you want to see what this really, it's horrific. We take on a ton of casualties. It's not pretty. It's not elegant. It's just massive. Like, you're going to try and overwhelm the Germans with sheer numbers and hope that they get through, which is, there's going to be a lot of casualties. So if you want to see what this looks like, you guys can watch the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, because this is what it does. And Steven Spielberg tried very hard to kind of recreate this. But I do not like to watch it because it's very sad and it just really is gut wrenching. But I think it is important for you guys to see it. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the commander of these forces. He later goes on to become president of the United States. So some of the stuff that they've got going on here. So on the beaches of Normandy, we've got big cliffs and guns. Right, this is German. Then we've got smaller cliffs and guns. These are called pillboxes. Both Germans and Japanese use these. So they're kind of like these little pockets that are built into cliffs and walls, and they're reinforced by concrete, and basically they are like machine gun nests. So you can go and fire out, and they're really hard to see into. They're camouflaged well, so it's a really good, they have the high ground type of a thing. So then after that, we've got barbed wire and minefields that are put down. Then something called hedgehogs, which these are these giant, if you guys have seen these before on TV or pictures, they are massive and they're big black like steel structures, and they've got mines attached to them. And basically if you can see them if they're in shallower water, but if they're out further and your boat goes over them, then it's going to basically rip the bottom of your boat out or blow it up. Then there's ramps. They're driven into the sand, so you have to avoid those. Teller mines. They're going the opposite direction. They're covered in seaweed, so you can't really see them. They are covered at high tide, and again, you have to get through all of this stuff. And then we have what we call Belgian gates, 10-foot tall steel structures that are put into the sand, and they have mines at the top. So basically, you're going to have to get through all of this stuff to try and get onto the shores of Normandy. This is not a good scenario. So, what does it look like? We've got a little over 11,000 planes or other aircraft. We've got 14,000 actual flights or missions that go out, 6,000 Navy vessels, for over 4,000 Allied deaths. About 2,500 of those are American. So we lose the bigger number here. It was successful in that a lot of Germans are taken as casualties, 156,000 troops, right? So it's a really big thing. It's massive in scale. Then we've got fighting that's still happening in Europe, the Battle of Stalingrad. So the gist of this is that it's invading Russia in the winter. And what happens is that Germany breaks their non-aggression pact with Russia and turns against Russia. And so then Russia, in turn, joins the Allied powers. And it's real kind of hesitant as far as it's really the epitome of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Nobody really trusts USSR, but they're using each other as allies to defeat Hitler. So Germany turns on the Soviets and goes to invade them and doesn't listen to history, doesn't pay attention to Napoleon, and invades Russia in the winter. This is a terrible idea. And so by the time you get to Stalingrad, which is a major city, the Soviets basically are just like, fine, I'm used to this winter and you are not. So they just keep backing out of the city, and they've destroyed their own city, basically. They've taken anything of value out, and then Germany is bombing it as well in advance of German troops. So when the ground troops get to Stalingrad, there's nobody there. There's nothing there. Things are booby-trapped, but the Germans find no supplies, nothing to help them. Their own supply line is way, way long, and they get cut off from it. So now you've got a bunch of German soldiers who are basically trapped in the middle of Russia in the winter. Guess what? They're gonna die. All right. So the idea of this is called urban warfare because it's being fought in a city, and they're using the city against the invading force. This is the first major defeat for the Germans. Okay. Russia's like, nope, we're not going to go back. And literally, if you try to run away, you're going to get shot by your own people, right? So kind of very much that same Japanese idea, only it's in Russia. This is a very interesting thing I found about, they're still discovering bodies and things after the Battle of Stalingrad. I highly urge you to watch this. It's very fascinating. Then we get to the Manhattan Project. We're getting towards the end of the war here. So during the entire Second World War, we've got the development of lots of scientific things. The Manhattan Project is the code name for the atomic bomb and developing it. And we get some of the world's best scientists in it. And it gets tested out in the deserts of the United States. So we've got the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb, A bomb and H bomb. So the atomic bomb, based in New Mexico, and we have, like I said, the best and the brightest scientists working on it. A lot of other countries are also working on technology of this type. We finally get it figured out. It's a devastating weapon. And Robert Oppenheimer, who is a leading scientist on this operation, says, I am Shiva, the destroyer of worlds. He quotes the Bhagavad Gita when there's a successful test of it. So basically he's saying like, oh my God, like I have become death. I'm the destroyer of worlds. So during this time, FDR dies in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, is told that the Manhattan Project had been going on. Had no idea as vice president this thing even existed. He inherits this war, He's in the middle of it, and then he's told of this, and within days he has to make a decision to use this bomb or not use this bomb. He drops two. He drops one on Hiroshima. 100,000 people, regular people in Japan, are casualties, are either killed or wounded so severely. Later on, 2 days later, August 8th, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrender a week later. Okay. The bombs themselves are called Little Boy and Fat Man. They are dropped out of a plane called the Enola Gay, and they were sent there on the USS Indianapolis. The USS Indianapolis actually sinks after delivering these bombs, and a lot of the crew gets eaten by sharks because it was a secret mission, so nobody knew that the USS Indianapolis was out there. Whole nother interesting story. I've actually listened to people from the USS Indianapolis in person. Crazy stuff. All right, so this is what it looks like after this type of bomb goes off. All right. I think this is a really interesting political cartoon where 60th anniversary of Hiroshima, and kids saying, which terrorist group did that? Because we associate these big bombs and things with the United States. The argument for doing it was that it was going to shorten the war by a lot. And so it was going to end up saving lives, even though it was going to kill a lot of people because it would have shortened the war. So that was Truman's argument for it. You can go back and forth and debate which way or the other. Was it right? Was it wrong? All right. I'm going to stop there for this part, because that essentially ends World War II. We're going to talk about the home front and stuff here later on, but we're going to be done for right now.